So bare minimum, you're going to want some cheap paints, a good silver and gold paint, some primer, and some brushes. Depending on what you're painting, it could be a good idea to prime your models white or black, but personally I prefer a thin coat of black primer and a quick spray of white from above. There are plenty of priming techniques you can use, but for now let's just stick to the basics. So you can either purchase these one bottle at a time for around $1 each, either online or at your local retail giant, or you can just buy a set of them online like I did because you're lazy. I think my local Target sells this brand, and I think Walmart sells Apple Barrel. Can't say if they're equally viable, but you should be okay if you can only get Apple Barrel or something other than what brand I'm using. Either way, this set of colors costs $16 for 16 colors. Pretty good deal. I didn't even need half of these colors to paint my Plague Marines, so for the purpose of this video and your budget, I'll list a handful of paints you will need. A couple inks worth getting for making custom washes are red, black, and brown. If you want to save money, go to Target and get yourself a pink, leaf green, a black, a burnt umber, basically a darker brown, a yellow, and a red, and an orange, or pumpkin, either works. You want at least these colors for painting and for painting the Plague Marine. If you want to skimp on metal colors, that's okay, but for stuff like trim and weapons, you'll want a silver and a gold paint. Having a Vallejo airbrush silver paint is pretty well recommended by folks who know more than me. I'm also using their airbrush gold paint, which is kind of a weak gold because of its purpose for airbrushing, but get a cheap gold if you want. Maybe just get Vallejo's model paint line of gold color to keep your sanity. A big shortcut to getting decent looking minis are washes. Citadel and Vallejo have theirs for about $5 a pot, just like their paints, but we're going to use distilled water, matte medium, or glazed medium if you're strapped for cash and can only get one of the two, and our inks to make some custom washes. You could also add some flow aid to them to give them a smoother application, but it isn't necessary if you're strapped for cash. This will save us from having to splooge on nice washes, which would limit our budget, but for more paint colors and additives, primer, brushes, etc. If you want to really go cheap on this, you can get some acrylic floor polish instead of matte medium. Basically it's the same stuff. If you can afford to get a flesh wash, some Agrax Earthshade, go for it. We're basically going to make our own cheap knockoffs because we're skipping on our paint budget so we can buy things that will improve our painting. You really only need a couple empty droppy bottles, which you can get for a couple bucks at a hobby store. So first things first, fill your bottle about halfway with distilled water. Then fill it almost to the top with your glaze or matte medium. Now take your eyedropper and add 1 drop of black ink, or 2, and like 10 drops of brown. Now, this isn't an exact science, but I found this recipe will give you a pretty basic dark brown wash. Now, you can add more brown ink if you think it needs to be a little bit more vibrant, but I wouldn't add any more black ink. And then for the flesh wash, do the same stuff with another bottle, the water and the medium, okay? And then this time add 3 drops of brown ink and 10 drops of red ink, okay? And then you can play with those ratios to get a type of flesh tone that you feel comfortable with working with. Sometimes I'll add a little bit more brown to give it like a little bit more of a muddy kind of a wash, but still you want red to be, you want kind of like a bloody red. And this should give you a strong, dirty blood kind of color. With the caps on and shake these up, go ahead and do some tests on a white piece of paper. You should have a faint dark brown and a faint fleshy looking red colors. Time to prime our mini. Give your minis a quick coat all around. Try to always be moving your paint spray back and forth so you don't pile up paint in any one spot and clog up detail. Try to get some underneath the model and above, once again trying to keep your spray back and forth so you don't pile up paint. Also, be careful with how close you get with your spray. Not only can this cause paint to pile up and clog detail, the chemicals in the paint can eat away at the plastic if you aren't a certain distance away. Now, Take your white primer, if you have it, and from an angle facing down towards your Mini's head, give it a quick back and forth for a highlight. Feel free to do this from a few directions, being careful not to cover too much of your Mini. This will give you a nice, cheap, and easy highlight that you can use to help see details, and even give you some value changes if your paint layers are thin enough. I'm going to paint a Death Guard Plague Marine. The paints I'm going to use for the base coats are simple enough. I got this cheap leaf green, which is itself a decent Plague Marine color, but I want a more dull yellow green, so I'm going to add some yellow and glaze medium to it. I got this cheap dark brown called Burnt Umber, but it's basically a leather brown or a dark brown. We have this black paint. It's not the darkest, but it'll do for cleaning up joints and odd areas where you need it. If you feel like, you could add a drop of black ink if you absolutely need the blackest black. We also have this, a little bit of pink goes a long way. We also have this light flesh tone color. It's almost white. Take your workhorse brush. I like to use cheap number 8 brushes that I can buy a bunch of in a pack, but if I ever find cheap packs of number 3 brushes, that would be perfect for me. Load up a little of your mixed green on your brush, give it a few strokes on your palette to even out your paint and thin it a little. Now let's paint the armor. Try to use the sides of your brush to lay the color more than the tip. This will give you a better application and will also preserve your brush tip for a bit longer. Don't be afraid to use your brush tip. Just be aware that you're better off using the side of the brush for applying color to large areas, as it will give you smoother application with less brush stroke texture to the paint on your Mini. Take your time and try not to make mistakes, but don't feel bad if you get paint where you don't want it. If you can, wet a brush and erase it before it dries. Go for it. Otherwise, just keep laying on your base color. We'll paint over mistakes later. A trick I picked up from several painter YouTubers is to have a wet brush to the side that you can quickly switch to rub out some paint you just applied. Alright, now that we got our first color down, let's color any fleshy bits or bones, this off-white flesh tone. You might need a few coats to get a decent coverage. Don't worry too much about it. We're either going to use thin paint or washes to cover it. You just want a base color that will allow the color to pop. Try to be careful not to get any on the armor base coat. If you do, it's not the end of the world. We'll just have to use our side brush to erase it or correct it later on. Now that we have all of our fleshy bits and bones base coated with our light flesh tone, let's take the flesh wash we made earlier and apply it to areas like the blight grenades on the Marine's hip. If his face is exposed, wash over that sparingly. If there are any weird fleshy areas on the Marine's pauldrons or backpack, etc., give them a quick wash, and feel free to layer up additional coats of the wash as they dry, but be careful not to oversaturate the color of your wash. What we're after is a transparent layer of color above a light background, giving us the illusion of flesh. Now let's get some pink paint on our brush. Make sure you have enough water in your brush to give you a slightly thinner application. Be careful not to get too much water in the mix. We want thin pink paint, but we don't want it to run out of control or break down completely. Paint over the flesh tone of the tentacles. Be careful not to get pink where it doesn't belong. Now let's take our silver, add a drop of black ink to it so we have a darker metal, and color any chains or swords or pipes, etc. Then take our gold and paint the trim on the pauldrons and on the breastplate. I prefer to leave their leg armor untrimmed, but if you want to paint the trim, go for it. Now for some magic. I say that because Agrax Earthshade and things like Nuln Oil are often referred to as liquid talent because of how quickly they help give minis definition and shading. This is a pretty standard approach that GW has promoted for years, and while it's relatively simple, as you progress in skill as a mini painter, you'll find that you'll be able to get more out of wash techniques. So take some of our butt juice and paint it over the majority of the model, avoiding the fleshy bits. Try not to use too much of the wash. We want some runoff, that's okay, but it will settle into crevices and cracks, giving us free shading and definition. Just be careful not to let the wash pool up in areas at the bottom of the Mini or anywhere for that matter. The idea is that this wash will slightly darken then the colors beneath it by adding a thin transparent layer of dark brown and fall into recesses in the Mini, making them darker and more defined. And look at that. With just a few coats of paint and a wash, and your dude looks pretty good. At this point, we follow the same steps for the backpack. We prime it, give it a zenithal highlight, that's when you spray it with the white from above, paint the base coat green, paint the base coat flesh tone, paint the dark silver and gold bits, give it a quick coat of butt juice, then do a coat or two of flesh wash on the, bony areas or fleshy areas, and paint any tentacles with your pink. I realized I didn't go over supplies for doing your bases. What I used is this bag of black sand I got at a hobby store and some plastic cement. I try to be generous with the cement, laying down a few coats on the base, dumping some sand over it, letting the excess sand fall off, and when I'm satisfied with how well the base is covered, I like to gently dab some more cement on top in order to solidify the sand on the base. Wait for it to dry, then you can either leave it or put it in a little more effort and paint over it. For these guys, I like painting the rim of the base brown, then a couple coats of green over it, and some brown areas over the black sand and some green areas on top of that, and boom, you have a painted Plague Marine with his base painted.